Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. My name is Samuel Grayson, and I live in the quiet town of Ashbourne in Derbyshire, England. I was 29 years old when the events I'm about to tell you changed my life forever. It was late September, and I was driving home from a work meeting in Nottingham. I had been traveling all day, and the thought of the 2-hour drive home through the dark, winding country roads was not exactly something I was looking forward to. But I needed to get home, so I set off around dusk, hoping to make it back before the night fully took hold. That night, however, I would encounter something that made me wish I had never left the city. The A52, the road I was taking, is notorious for its twists and turns. It cuts through miles of farmland, with nothing but the occasional hedge and stone wall lining the way. The lack of streetlights made the drive even more unsettling. By the time I left the outskirts of Derby and entered the countryside, the sun had completely disappeared, and the night was pitch black. The only light came from my car's headlights, which seemed weak against the inky darkness. I wasn't one to get easily spooked, but something about that night felt off. There was an unnatural stillness to the air, as if the world around me had gone silent. The road stretched on, empty and desolate. No other cars passed me for miles, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the tires on the wet asphalt. I was about halfway home when I first saw her. At the time, I thought she was just a young girl walking along the side of the road, but there was something immediately strange about her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of my headlights. Her head was down, her dark hair hanging over her face, and she was dressed in a pale, tattered white dress. At first, I thought maybe she had gotten lost or had broken down somewhere nearby, but as I slowed the car and moved closer, I felt a sudden wave of dread wash over me. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep going, to leave her there on the side of the road. I ignored that feeling, rolling the window down slightly and calling out to her. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" I asked. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. She didn't respond. She didn't even lift her head. She just stood there, motionless, as if she hadn't heard me at all. The longer I stared at her, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the way she stood, so still, so lifeless, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I began to feel lightheaded, almost as if the air had been sucked out of the car. I called out again, a little louder this time, but there was no answer. No movement. Just the eerie stillness of the girl standing on the side of the road. A part of me wanted to step out of the car and check on her, but something kept me rooted to my seat, an overwhelming sense of fear that I couldn't shake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she slowly began to lift her head. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her, and when her face came into view, I felt my stomach turn. Her eyes, those black, soulless eyes, stared back at me. They weren't just dark, they were completely devoid of any color, any life. Just two pitch-black orbs, like deep, endless pits, staring straight into me. A cold, paralytic fear gripped me. I had never seen anything like it. Those eyes, there was no humanity in them, no spark of life. It was as if I was looking into the void itself. And then she smiled. It was a slow, creeping smile, one that sent chills down my spine. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper but echoed inside my mind. "Help me," she said, though it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a command, like a threat. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The car roared down the empty road, and I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see those black eyes again. Didn't want to know if she was still standing there or, worse, if she was following me. For the next several miles, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had heard stories about ghosts and spirits haunting the countryside, but I had never believed in any of it. But now, after seeing that girl, I wasn't so sure. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. About 15 minutes later, I reached a small village. The streetlights were a welcome sight, and I pulled into a petrol station to collect myself. I sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. When I finally got out, the station attendant, an older man, looked at me with concern. "You all right there, lad?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was. "Yeah, just saw something strange back on the road," I said, trying to downplay the fear still gnawing at me. The man's expression darkened. "You were on the A52, weren't you?" I nodded again, confused by his reaction. He sighed, shaking his head. "You saw her, didn't you? The girl?" I froze. You know about her?" The man looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "She's been haunting that road for as long as anyone can remember. People say she's the ghost of a young girl who was killed in a hit-and-run accident years ago. She's been trying to get someone to help her ever since. But it's those eyes, lad. Once you see her eyes, there's no getting rid of her." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, no getting rid of her?" The man looked at me, his expression grim. "She'll follow you. Might not be tonight, might not be tomorrow, but she'll come for you. That's the curse of the black-eyed girl." I didn't want to believe him, but something in his voice told me he wasn't joking. I thanked him and quickly left the station, my mind racing. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those black eyes were still on me, somewhere in the dark. For weeks, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that I had imagined the whole thing. But then, late one night, I woke up to the sound of a faint knock on my front door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, soft, steady, insistent. My heart raced as I got out of bed and made my way downstairs. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated for a moment before slowly opening the door, half expecting to see her standing there. But there was no one. The street outside was empty, silent. I closed the door and turned to head back upstairs, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the window. I froze, my blood turning to ice. There, standing just outside, barely visible in the dim light, was the black-eyed girl. Her face was pressed against the glass, her lips curled into that same chilling smile. I don't know how long I stood there staring at her, paralyzed by fear. But when I finally blinked, she was gone, leaving nothing but a faint outline of her face on the cold glass. That was the last time I saw her, but the fear never left me. Every time I drive down a dark, empty road, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there waiting. They say the black-eyed girl haunts the A52, but I think it's more than that. I think once you see her, once you look into those black, soulless eyes, she never really lets you go. And no matter where I am, no matter how far I go, I'll never be free of her. So if you ever find yourself driving down that road at night, and you see a young girl standing on the side, don't stop. Don't offer her help. Just keep driving. Because once you see those black eyes, there's no escape. I never believed in ghosts. Even after hearing the occasional story about haunted houses or eerie late-night encounters, I brushed them off. Ghosts were for horror movies and Halloween stories, nothing more. At least, that's what I thought until the night I first heard them. It all started innocuously enough at a friend's dinner party. We were a tight-knit group, always poking fun at each other, sharing stories, and having a few drinks. But this night, one of our friends, Jared, had a story that made the entire table fall silent. I've been messing around with these apps, Jared said, his voice unusually serious for someone who usually couldn't take anything seriously. Supposedly, they let you communicate with spirits. I snorted. You mean like a digital Ouija board? Jared nodded. Kind of. Except it's supposed to pick up on frequencies that humans can't hear. Spirits are supposed to communicate through it. I didn't think it would work, but man, some of the stuff I've heard on it freaked me out. Our group burst into laughter, except for Jared. His deadpan expression didn't change. He was serious. What did you hear? I asked, half interested, half amused. Jared glanced around the table, his eyes narrowing. I heard my grandmother's voice. She passed 3 years ago. The laughter died down. Impossible, I muttered. I thought so too, Jared continued, but I wasn't imagining it. She said things only she could know, and she wasn't the only voice. My curiosity was piqued. Still, I wasn't sold. I'll download it tonight, I said, smirking, and if I hear anything, I'll let you know. He nodded, his face pale. Just be careful. It's not all friendly voices. Some of them... He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Some of them don't want to be heard. Later that night, after returning home, I downloaded the app on my phone. It was late, probably too late to be messing with something like this, but I figured I'd prove Jared wrong. After all, he was always a bit of a prankster. This had to be one of his long cons, and I was ready to call him out on it. I sat in my living room, lights dim, phone in hand. The app opened to a basic interface, just a dark screen with a frequency bar fluctuating along the bottom. It was eerily silent. I hit start, and the app began to scan for electromagnetic disturbances, whatever that meant. At first, nothing happened. I stared at the screen, waiting for a jump scare or some corny, pre-programmed ghost noises. The minutes ticked by, and my skepticism grew. I was ready to turn it off and go to bed when the first sound crackled through the speaker. It was faint, like a radio station barely coming through the static. "Hello?" I whispered, unsure why I was suddenly speaking so softly. More static. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, gentle but disembodied. "Help." I froze. The word was unmistakable. My heart thudded in my chest. I glanced around my empty living room, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows. But I was alone. "Help?" I repeated into the phone, feeling foolish. "Please, help me." I stared at the screen, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. It had to be some kind of trick, an algorithm programmed to detect voices from random radio frequencies. But the desperation in her voice felt too real. I tried again. "Who are you?" Silence. For a long time there was nothing but the soft hum of static. I almost thought it was over when the voice returned, clearer, louder. "I'm trapped. It's dark. So dark." A chill ran down my spine. I turned off the app, shaking my head. This was getting too weird. Maybe Jared had been right. This wasn't something I should have been messing with. But the curiosity gnawed at me. I didn't want to admit it, but I was hooked. I spent the next few days in a haze. The voice lingered in my mind, and I kept wondering whether I should try it again. Eventually, late one night, I gave in. I waited for the familiar static to fill the room. Again, the same voice, pleading, lost, trapped. But this time, there was something different. A second voice. It was male, darker, more threatening. "She's lying," the man's voice hissed through the phone. "She belongs here." My breath caught in my throat. Who are you?" Silence, then the crackling returned. When the voice spoke again, it was no longer a whisper. "Don't listen to him," the woman said. Her voice was rushed now, frantic. "Please, help me. You have to help me." Suddenly, the male voice interrupted, louder than before. "She's one of us. She can't leave." I turned off the app. My hands were trembling. and I realized that I had broken into a cold sweat. My rational brain fought with my instincts. This couldn't be real. It had to be a joke, right? But I knew. Deep down, I knew that whatever I was hearing was not of this world. The next day, I reached out to Jared. When he answered the phone, his voice was tense. "You used it again, didn't you?" "Yeah," I admitted. "I heard her again, and a man. He said she was lying." Jared cursed under his breath. "That app, I think it's more than just some gimmick, man. I deleted it after my last session. There was this voice, angry, demanding. He told me I had no right to listen, that I was crossing a line." A shiver went down my spine. "Get rid of it," Jared warned. "Whatever you heard, don't engage with it anymore." But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to admit it, but I was obsessed. The woman's voice haunted me. Each time I turned on the app, her pleas became more desperate. Each time the man's voice grew angrier. One night, I gave in completely. I turned on the app, but this time I recorded it. I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. As the static filled the air, I waited. "She's lying," the man hissed again, his voice harsh and jagged, like nails scraping a chalkboard. "Turn it off." "Why should I believe you?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was a long, painful silence before he responded. "Because she wants you to die. She wants to drag you into the dark." My heart pounded in my chest. Was it possible? Could I be in danger? Suddenly, her voice broke through the static, louder than ever before, but distorted, warped. "He's lying. You have to help me, please. You have to help me." I shut off the app and threw my phone across the room, heart racing. The next few nights, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard them, their voices battling for control, for my attention. But the woman's voice had changed. It no longer sounded pleading. It sounded angry. I couldn't take it anymore. I deleted the app and tried to go back to my life, but the damage was already done. Late one night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. No phone, no app, just a whisper in the dark. "I told you," the man's voice said, faint but unmistakable. "She wants you too." Then, from the foot of my bed, the woman's voice, low and full of rage. "I'm coming for you." I haven't slept since. That's the thing about listening to the voices from the other side. Once you hear them, once you let them in, they never leave. My name is Jack Landry, and I live in Savannah, Georgia. I was 32 when this happened to me. I'll never forget that night. It still sends a chill down my spine when I think about it. I was heading from a bar in the historic district back to my apartment on East Broad Street. My friends had left earlier, but I decided to stick around a bit longer, enjoying the late-night air, walking through the cobblestone streets. Savannah is famous for its haunted places, but I never believed in any of that. It was just tourist stuff to me, until that night. As I passed by the Colonial Park Cemetery, something strange caught my attention. I've walked by it 1,000 times, but that night it felt different. The air was thicker, almost suffocating. The usual warm breeze had disappeared, replaced by a cold, unnatural stillness. I had always heard rumors about the cemetery, how people saw things late at night, how it was cursed, but I never gave them much thought. That night, though, it was like the cemetery itself was calling me. I stopped in front of the iron gate, and I swear I felt a pull, like something, or someone, wanted me inside. Against my better judgment, I pushed the gate open. The old iron creaked loudly, almost as if it were warning me not to enter, but I ignored it. I stepped inside. The cemetery looked darker than usual. The streetlights from outside barely penetrated the thick canopy of oak trees draped in Spanish moss. My footsteps were almost silent as I walked along the worn stone path, my eyes scanning the tombstones. There were no tourists, no other locals, just me and the dead. About halfway through the cemetery, I heard it. a soft whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but the words became clearer as I stood frozen in place. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone was speaking directly into my ear. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. I was alone. I felt a deep, gnawing sense of dread start to bubble up inside me, but I kept moving forward, trying to shake it off. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by a large old tombstone was a figure, dressed in dark clothes, almost blending in with the shadows. I could barely make out the outline, but it was unmistakably a person. They were facing away from me, staring down at the ground. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I tried again, louder this time. "Hey, you okay?" Still nothing. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. I began walking toward them, unsure of what I was going to do when I got closer. Something about the way they were standing, so still, made my skin crawl, but I was too curious to turn back. As I got within a few feet, I stopped dead in my tracks. The figure slowly turned around to face me, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. The thing standing in front of me had no eyes, just deep black sockets where its eyes should have been. Its mouth was twisted into a horrible grin, too wide to be natural. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed with fear. The thing took a step toward me, and I finally snapped out of my trance. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose stone and falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, echoing all around me as I sprinted toward the exit. When I reached the gate, I slammed into it, nearly knocking it off its hinges as I forced it open and threw myself outside. I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for air, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I looked back at the cemetery, expecting to see the figure standing at the entrance, but it was gone. The whispers were gone too. The night was silent again. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that thing in my dreams, its eyeless face staring at me, its twisted grin burning itself into my mind. I avoided the cemetery at all costs, even going out of my way to take different routes home. But the nightmares didn't stop. One night, I was walking home from work when I noticed something strange. Every streetlight I passed flickered as I walked under it. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but when I reached my apartment, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. Scratched into my front door in deep, jagged lines was a message. "We are waiting." I moved out of Savannah shortly after that. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had experienced. I never went back to the cemetery, never told anyone what I had seen. But even now, years later, I still feel like something is watching me, waiting for me to come back. Maybe I'll never escape it. Maybe it'll follow me for the rest of my life. The scariest part? I've heard other stories. People who've walked past that cemetery late at night. People who've seen things, heard things. They all tell the same story. About the whispers. About the figure with no eyes. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I do know one thing. Whatever is in that cemetery isn't resting in peace. It started with footsteps. Just a soft, steady cadence, one that I could barely hear at first. I would be walking home from work, cutting through the dimly lit streets of my small town, and in the distance, far behind me it seemed, there would be a faint sound, the kind of sound you don't even notice at first because it blends so seamlessly with the quiet rustle of trees and the hum of distant traffic. But once I noticed, I couldn't unhear it. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. Everyone hears things sometimes, especially when they're alone and the night feels too still. So, I ignored it. I walked faster, telling myself I was being silly, that I'd been listening to too many true crime podcasts. But the footsteps followed. No matter how fast I walked, how erratic my path was, they stayed behind me, keeping pace, matching my movements. And they always stopped when I stopped. I remember the first time I froze, my heart racing, and turned around quickly, expecting to see someone there. But the street behind me was empty. Just a long stretch of cracked pavement under dim streetlights, leading back toward town. My ears strained to hear any sound, but all that greeted me was silence. I waited, holding my breath, and the longer I stood there, the more foolish I felt. After all, if someone had been following me, they would have had no time to hide. Right? Weeks passed, and the footsteps became a part of my routine. Some nights, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Other nights, I was certain there was someone lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. I'd turn around, heart in my throat, only to see nothing but empty streets and swaying trees. It was unsettling, but I figured it was harmless. Until I noticed the shadow. It was late, around midnight, and I was walking the same familiar route home from the diner where I worked. The sky was clouded over, with no moon to cast light, and the only illumination came from the orange glow of the street lamps. I had been hearing the footsteps again that night, the same soft tread behind me, when something in the corner of my vision caught my eye. A figure. It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse. No. This time I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing in the shadows just outside the range of the streetlight. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned my head fully to get a better look. But when I did, the figure was gone. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. It couldn't have been a trick of the light. I'd seen someone, or something, standing there, tall and thin, unnaturally so. But no matter how hard I stared into the darkness, I couldn't see anything now. I walked faster that night. Much faster. After that, things escalated quickly. The following day, I told my friend Sarah about what I'd seen. She was the practical type and had always been the one to pull me back to reality whenever I let my imagination run wild. "You've probably just been working too hard," she said, sipping her coffee. "You're tired, it's late, and your mind's playing tricks on you." I nodded, though her explanation didn't sit right with me. The figure I'd seen wasn't just a trick of the mind. It had been real. I felt it. That night, as I walked home, the footsteps returned. Closer now, much closer. This time it felt as though the person, or whatever it was just a few paces behind me. The steady rhythm of their steps matched mine exactly. I could feel the presence behind me like a weight pressing on my shoulders. I stopped abruptly, hoping to catch whoever it was by surprise. But again, when I turned around, there was no one, just an empty street, and the echo of my own footsteps ringing in my ears. But there was something new this time. A low whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a breathy sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. It felt like a threat, a warning. Goosebumps erupted across my skin, and I bolted the rest of the way home. I started seeing the shadow more frequently after that. It was always just at the edge of my vision, always standing still, watching. Sometimes it would be in the corner of my bedroom window when I looked outside at night. Other times, it would be across the street, half hidden behind a tree or a lamppost. Always watching, always waiting. I stopped telling people about it. Sarah didn't believe me, and I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy to anyone else. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just some prank, and it wasn't my imagination. I could feel it. This thing, whatever it was, had latched onto me. And then, the dream started. In my dreams, I was always running through dark woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, the footsteps echoed, heavy, deliberate, closing in on me. And every time, just as I felt the presence right behind me, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. But the worst part was that even after I woke, I could still hear the footsteps, faint and distant, somewhere in the house. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was done being scared, done being haunted by whatever this thing was. I had to confront it. I walked the same route home, but this time, I was prepared. I had my phone in my hand, ready to call someone if things went south. My plan was simple. When I heard the footsteps again, I would turn around immediately, no hesitation, and catch whoever or whatever was following me. The footsteps started as usual, faint and far away. But as I walked, they grew louder, closer. I could feel the presence behind me, like a cold wind at my back. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. When the footsteps were close enough that it felt like they were right on top of me, I spun around. There, standing under the glow of the streetlight, was the figure. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its body was thin, emaciated. Its skin, if you could call it that, was stretched tight over its bones, gray and leathery. Its face was a blur, shifting and indistinct, like looking at something through a veil of smoke. My breath hitched in my throat. I should have run, should have screamed, but I was frozen in place, my legs refusing to move. The thing just stood there watching me with eyes that were too dark, too deep. And then, it moved. It took a step forward, its long limbs unfolding with unnatural grace. The way it moved wasn't human. There was no hesitation, no effort. It was like it was gliding toward me, silent and terrifying. I stumbled back, finally finding the strength to move, but my legs were weak, and my body felt like it was moving through molasses. I tripped and fell hard onto the pavement, my phone skittering out of my hand. The creature was almost on me now, its towering form looming over me, casting a long shadow. I scrambled back, my palms scraping against the rough concrete, but it was no use. The creature reached down with one of its long, bony hands, its fingers stretching out toward my face. Just before it touched me, I heard the voice. "Leave." It wasn't my voice, nor was it the creature's. It was a low, growling command, reverberating in the air around us. The creature paused, its hand hovering just inches from my face. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, it jerked back and melted into the shadows, vanishing completely. I lay there on the ground for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally had the strength to move, I grabbed my phone and ran all the way home without looking back. Since that night, I haven't seen the figure again, but I still feel its presence. It's always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its chance. The footsteps have stopped, but my dreams have only gotten worse. Now, instead of running, I'm always trapped in the dark, with those eyes watching me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I know one day it will come back for me, and when it does, I don't think I'll be able to run fast enough. My name is Samuel Harper, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I was 28 when this incident happened to me, and it changed the way I view the world. At the time, I was living in a small cabin near the base of Mount Hood. I had always been a nature lover, and I took every chance I could to escape the bustle of the city. That year, I had rented a remote cabin for the summer, wanting to spend as much time as possible hiking and exploring the woods. It was peaceful out there. No neighbors for miles, just the trees, wildlife, and silence. But that silence was broken one night, and the memory of it haunts me to this day. It was a quiet evening in early August. I had just finished a long hike and was sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. As dusk settled, the familiar sounds of the forest began to emerge, the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals moved about. I always found it comforting, a reminder that I was far away from the chaos of the city. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first, but there was an unnatural stillness in the air. The crickets, which usually filled the night with their rhythmic chirping, had gone silent. The wind, which had been gently rustling the trees, had stopped completely. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just one of those odd moments in nature. I went inside, made myself a cup of tea, and settled into my favorite chair to read. It was around midnight when I heard it. The sound that still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. A baby crying. At first I thought I had imagined it. A crying baby in the middle of the woods? It didn't make any sense. There were no houses anywhere near my cabin, and certainly no children. But then I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. The high-pitched wail of an infant in distress. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of my brain told me that it couldn't be a real baby. There was no way. But the sound was so clear, so real, that it was hard to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the door, telling myself that I was just going to take a quick look. Maybe it was some kind of animal mimicking the sound, or maybe someone had gotten lost in the woods with a baby, though that seemed highly unlikely. As I stepped outside, the crying grew louder. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, past the tree line about 50 yards from my cabin. I hesitated for a moment, my gut screaming at me to stay inside, to lock the door and forget about it. But something in the sound, a desperate, pleading tone, pushed me forward. I made my way through the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The crying continued, always just ahead of me, as if it was leading me deeper into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, but I kept going, my curiosity and concern overriding my fear. After what felt like hours of walking, I found myself in a small clearing. The crying had stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing in around me. I stood there scanning the area with my flashlight, looking for any sign of the baby, but there was nothing, just trees and undergrowth. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the weak beam of my flashlight, was an old wooden cradle. It looked ancient, the wood cracked and weathered from years of exposure to the elements. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached it, dread pooling in my stomach. There was no baby in the cradle, but as I got closer, I could see something else. A small tattered blanket, stained with what looked like old dried blood. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard it again, the crying, but this time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering, and for a brief moment I saw something standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman. She was tall, her hair long and matted, her clothes tattered and hanging loosely from her skeletal frame. Her face, though, it wasn't human. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. And she was holding a baby. The baby's cries were deafening now, echoing through the clearing, piercing my ears. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to scream, as the woman slowly started walking toward me. Her steps were unnaturally slow, deliberate, as if she was savoring the fear that radiated off of me. I finally snapped out of my paralysis and bolted. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back. The baby's cries followed me, growing louder and more desperate with every step I took. I could feel her behind me, the weight of her presence pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. When I finally reached my cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The crying stopped immediately, leaving behind an eerie silence that filled the cabin. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting by the window, watching the woods, waiting for any sign of movement. But the woman never came, the baby never cried again. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? It sounded insane. A crying baby in the woods, a ghostly woman with no eyes. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A few months later, I did some research on the area and found something that made my blood run cold. There had been a series of strange disappearances in those woods back in the early 1900s. Women and children who had vanished without a trace. The locals believed the woods were cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who were never found. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Even now, years later, I can still hear that baby crying in my nightmares. I don't know what that thing was, or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. I'll never be able to forget the sound of that baby crying for help deep in the woods. My name is Andrew Ellis, and I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was 31 when this incident happened to me, and even now, years later, I still don't fully understand what I experienced. I was working as a freelance photographer at the time, traveling all over the country for various gigs. It was during one of these work trips that my life took a terrifying turn, one that I've been hesitant to talk about until now. It started in the summer of 2019. I had been hired to photograph a wedding in a small town called Eerie in Nevada. Eerie is a quiet, unassuming place, mostly known for its mining history and proximity to Great Basin National Park. The wedding itself went off without a hitch, and after 2 long days of shooting, I was ready to head back home to Salt Lake. But I decided to stay an extra night to explore the surrounding wilderness and grab some shots for my portfolio. It was a decision I would come to regret. That evening, after finishing a day of hiking and shooting in the mountains, I returned to my hotel room, exhausted. The sun had just set, and a heavy silence had fallen over the town. There was something unsettling about the stillness. It felt oppressive, like the weight of the desert was pressing down on everything. But I chalked it up to fatigue and settled into bed, eager for a good night's sleep before heading home the next day. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like the sound of someone walking down the hallway outside my room. I listened for a moment, then figured it was just another guest. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop right outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any other sound. But there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably just the night clerk doing rounds, or maybe another guest who had forgotten their room number. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel and started the long drive back to Salt Lake City. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach the night before, but I shrugged it off as just a case of nerves. After all, I'd been alone in remote places plenty of times before. It was part of the job. It wasn't until I got home that things started to get strange. A few days after returning, I began to feel like I was being watched. At first, it was just an odd sensation, like someone was standing behind me, watching me from the shadows. But every time I turned around, no one was there. I figured it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I had been working long hours, and stress can do strange things to your mind. But then, objects in my apartment began to move. It started with small things. My keys wouldn't be where I left them. A picture frame would be tilted. A door slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed it. I blamed it on my own forgetfulness at first, thinking I was just overtired. But as the days went by, the occurrences became harder to dismiss. I'd find chairs pulled away from the table, lights flickering on and off without explanation, and on one particularly disturbing occasion, I found my bedroom door locked from the inside when I hadn't touched it. The feeling of being watched grew more intense. Every time I was home, I felt like there was something there with me, something I couldn't see but knew was there, lurking just out of sight. It was subtle at first, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more oppressive it became. I started to avoid going home altogether, spending as much time as possible at cafes, friends' houses, or just walking around aimlessly to delay returning to my apartment. One night, about 3 weeks after I got back from Eerie, I had the most terrifying experience of my life. I had been working late and didn't get home until after midnight. As soon as I walked through the door, I felt it. That presence, it was stronger than ever. The air in my apartment felt heavy, thick, like I was wading through water. My heart started pounding and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I went into the living room and sat down on the couch trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it was there, coming from the corner of the room behind me. I froze, too terrified to move. The breathing grew louder, more ragged, like whatever was in the room was getting closer. I slowly turned my head toward the corner, and my blood ran cold. There in the darkness was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a shadowy, indistinct form. Its face, or what should have been its face, was nothing but darkness, a void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. But I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, like it was sucking all the air out of the room. I bolted from the couch, grabbing my car keys and running out the door without even locking it behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove aimlessly through the city for hours, too scared to go back. I knew that whatever that thing was, it had followed me home from Ely. After that night, I refused to stay in my apartment. I crashed at friends' places, rented motel rooms, and did whatever I could to avoid going back. But no matter where I went, the feeling of being followed never left me. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye, hear footsteps behind me when no one was there, and always feel like something was watching me. I started to research Ely, trying to find some kind of explanation for what was happening. What I found only made things worse. Ely had a history of strange disappearances and unexplained deaths, going back decades. Locals spoke of a sinister presence in the surrounding mountains, an entity that had been known to attach itself to people who ventured too far into the wilderness alone. Some claimed it was a spirit of someone who had died violently in the area. Others said it was something older, something malevolent that had always been there, waiting. I don't know what that thing was, but I'm certain it latched onto me that day in Ely. No matter where I go, it's always there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. I've moved 3 times since then, trying to escape it, but it follows me everywhere. It's relentless, and I know it won't stop until it has me. I don't sleep much anymore, and when I do, my dreams are filled with shadows. Tall, faceless figures standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with their hollow, empty eyes. Every morning I wake up, drenched in sweat, knowing that the nightmare isn't confined to my sleep. It's my reality now. I've spoken to priests, shamans, paranormal experts, anyone who might be able to help me, but nothing works. Whatever it is, it's not something that can be easily banished. It's attached to me, feeding off my fear, growing stronger every day. I don't know how much longer I can keep running, but one thing I'm sure of is that whatever this entity is, it's not done with me yet. It's just waiting, biding its time, getting closer and closer, and when it finally decides to show itself again, I don't think I'll be able to escape. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, demons, it all seemed like the stuff of horror movies. I would laugh when I heard people talk about seances or Ouija boards, brushing it off as superstition. So when my friend Jake suggested we try using one on a rainy Saturday night, I went along with it, thinking it was all just a harmless joke. It was me, Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and our mutual friend Emily. We had gathered at Jake's apartment, which was an old building on the outskirts of town. The place had a history, Jake liked to remind us, but to me it was just an old, creaky building that had seen better days. It was the kind of place where you could hear the wind howl through the cracks, where every little noise echoed in the empty hallways. The perfect setting for a so-called spooky night. Jake had ordered the Ouija board online. It looked cheap, just a flat piece of wood with letters, numbers, and the words yes, no, and goodbye printed on it. The planchette was a small triangular piece of plastic with a hole in the middle. It didn't seem like the kind of thing that could connect us to the dead, but I played along. It was supposed to be a fun way to pass the time, nothing more. "All right, let's summon some ghosts," Jake said with a grin, dimming the lights. Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled, clearly amused. Emily, on the other hand, looked a little uneasy, shifting in her seat. "I don't know, guys," Emily muttered, her voice soft. "I've heard stories about these things. What if something actually happens?" "Oh, come on, Em," I said, waving off her concerns. "It's just a game. Nothing's going to happen." I should have listened to her. We all sat in a circle around the coffee table, the Ouija board laid out in the center. The rain outside had picked up, the soft patter of drops against the window adding to the eerie atmosphere. Jake lit a few candles for effect, and soon the room was bathed in a dim, flickering glow. "Everyone put your fingers on the planchette," Jake instructed. We each placed 2 fingers lightly on the small plastic piece, our eyes locked on the board. For a moment no one said anything. The air felt heavy, like the room had gotten colder. I couldn't help but glance at Emily, who was biting her lip, clearly nervous. Jake cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Is there anyone here with us? Any spirit who wishes to communicate?" Nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. The only sound was the rain tapping against the window. I was about to make a joke when suddenly, the planchette twitched. It was barely noticeable, just a slight shift under our fingers, but enough to make us all freeze. Did someone just move it?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering. "No," Jake said, his eyes wide with excitement. "Keep going." We all leaned in a little closer, the tension palpable. Jake spoke again, his voice more serious this time. "Spirit, if you're here, what is your name?" For a moment, nothing. The planchette sat still, and I was about to call the whole thing off when it moved again. This time it slid slowly, deliberately, toward the letter M. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around the table, expecting to see someone smirking, but everyone looked just as confused as I felt. The planchette continued, moving from letter to letter. Mem, A, R, K. "Mark?" Jake read aloud. "Is that your name?" The planchette shot to yes. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. It was probably Jake or someone else messing with us. That had to be it. "Are you a good spirit?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The planchette moved again, this time slower, almost hesitant. N. O. The room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. My stomach twisted in knots, and for the first time that night, I started to feel a real sense of fear. This wasn't funny anymore. "Maybe we should stop," Sarah whispered, her hand already inching away from the planchette. Jake shook his head. "No way. We're just getting started." "Spirit, what do you want?" he asked, his voice firm. The planchette paused for a long moment before it began to move once more. K, I, L, L. We all recoiled, pulling our hands away from the planchette at once. The room went deadly silent, save for the sound of the rain pouring down outside. "This isn't funny, Jake," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Did you do that?" Jake looked just as pale as the rest of us. "I swear I didn't. I wasn't even touching it that hard." I stood up, my heart pounding. "That's enough. We're done." But before I could reach for the board, the candles flickered, and then, in an instant, they all went out. We were plunged into darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning through the window, casting eerie shadows across the room. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Relax," Jake said, though even he sounded unnerved. The power probably just went out. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. "Let's just pack up and get out of here." But as soon as I turned the light toward the board, I froze. The planchette was moving by itself. It slid across the board slowly, almost lazily, as if whatever was controlling it was in no rush. My breath caught in my throat as the planchette spelled out a single word. B-L-O-O-D. We didn't say anything for a long moment. No one moved. No one breathed. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. The room was too quiet, too still. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a primal fear taking over. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, there was a noise. A low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It was deep and animalistic, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. We all stood there, frozen, too terrified to move. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The growling grew louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the living room where we were standing. My flashlight flickered, the beam of light wavering as the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. "We need to leave. Now," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my phone and backed toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But just as I reached the hallway, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped, and Emily let out a small scream. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, rushing to the door and trying to open it. But no matter how hard he pulled, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. The growling grew louder, echoing through the apartment. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, and my hands were trembling as I shone the flashlight down the hallway. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move. A shadow, a figure, something tall and hunched just at the edge of the light. And then the lights came back on. The sudden brightness was almost blinding, and for a second, I thought we were safe. But the relief was short-lived, because standing in the hallway just a few feet away was a figure. It was tall, its head nearly scraping the ceiling, and its skin, if you could call it that, was gray and mottled, like it had been decaying for years. Its eyes were empty, hollow pits, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural grin. The thing looked more like a corpse than anything human. We all stood frozen, too terrified to move. The creature's mouth moved, but no words came out. Instead, the growling returned, low and rumbling, vibrating through the floor. "Get out!" Emily screamed, breaking the silence. The creature took a step forward, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward us. Without thinking, I grabbed the Ouija board and hurled it at the thing. It passed right through it, like it wasn't even there. The door behind us suddenly flew open, and we didn't waste any time. We bolted, running down the hallway and out into the rain, not stopping until we were outside and halfway down the street. We never went back to Jake's apartment after that night. He moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The landlord didn't ask too many questions. Apparently, we weren't the first tenants to leave abruptly. I haven't touched a Ouija board since. None of us talk about what happened that night, but I know we all remember. It haunts me in my dreams. The growling, the figure standing in the hallway, its empty eyes watching me. I don't know what we unleashed that night, but whatever it wasn't human, and I'm not sure it's gone. My name is Michael Vance, and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was 34 when this incident happened to me, and I'll never forget the fear it left in me. It all started one cold evening in November. I was driving back from my sister's house in Muncie, Indiana, to my apartment in Cincinnati. It was late, and the long stretch of empty highway had a way of making time stretch, leaving my mind wandering. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was during that drive that my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, but local enough to make me assume it was nothing out of the ordinary. As soon as I answered, though, my skin prickled with unease. A faint, raspy voice whispered my name on the other end, barely audible above the crackling static. "Michael." At first, I thought it was a prank. Someone trying to mess with me. The voice was weak, distorted, like it was struggling to get through a bad connection. There was something deeply unsettling about it. It wasn't until the voice spoke again that the fear began to creep in. "Michael, it's me, Dad." I froze, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My father had passed away 3 years ago from a heart attack. The last thing I had ever expected was to hear his voice again. "Dad?" I stammered, my mouth suddenly dry. "Who is this?" But the voice didn't answer me directly. It just continued, soft and broken. "I need to tell you something. You weren't there. You didn't know." Chills ran down my spine. The voice had the exact timbre of my father's, down to the slight wheeze he had developed in his last years. My heart raced and a cold sweat trickled down my back. I glanced at the phone screen. It still showed a number I didn't recognize, but the signal strength was flickering, jumping between a weak connection and nothing at all. I don't understand. "Dad, is that really you?" I whispered, trying to suppress the shaking in my voice. "I'm sorry," the voice continued, fading in and out. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I'm still here." I pulled the car over to the side of the road, my breath shallow and fast. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. My father had been gone for years. I had said my goodbyes at his funeral, had felt the finality of it. This was something else, something wrong. The line went silent for a moment, and I thought maybe the call had dropped. But then the voice returned, quieter now, almost a whisper. "Come to the house. I need you to find something in the basement." The basement. That damn basement. My father had always been secretive about it. He never let us go down there, always telling us there was nothing we needed to see. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to go through all his things, and the basement had remained locked and untouched. Before I could say anything, the call abruptly ended. The screen flashed once, showing the disconnected number, before the phone went black. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Every logical part of my brain told me it was impossible, that someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice I had heard truly belonged to my father. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with images of my father, standing in the doorway of that basement, calling out to me, his face pale and eyes hollow. When I woke, I knew there was only one thing I could do. I had to go back to the house. I had to see what he was talking about. The next day, I drove to my childhood home in Hamilton, just outside of Cincinnati. The house had been empty since my mother passed a few years before my father. It felt strange being there again, the place now cold and lifeless without the warmth of my parents. The key to the basement door was exactly where I remembered it, tucked away in a drawer in my father's old study. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, the key heavy in my hand. I had no idea what I was expecting to find down there, but the fear gnawed at me, making my stomach twist. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and slowly descended the creaky wooden steps. The basement was just as I remembered it, dim, damp, and filled with the smell of old wood and mildew. Boxes were piled high in the corners, covered in dust, untouched for years. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I started going through the boxes, one by one, my hands trembling. As I sifted through old papers and photographs, something caught my eye. Tucked away at the bottom of one of the boxes was an old cassette recorder. It looked ancient, the kind my father used to record family events when we were kids. I hadn't seen it in years. Curious, I pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static, the same crackling I had heard on the phone. Then, slowly, voices began to emerge from the noise. My heart pounded in my chest as I recognized them, my father, my mother, even myself as a child. It was a recording of one of our family dinners from decades ago. But then, The voices changed, warping into something darker. The laughter faded, replaced by whispers. In the background, a voice I didn't recognize started speaking, its tone low and menacing. I couldn't make out the words at first, but as the tape continued, the voice grew clearer. "I'm still here, Michael." I dropped the recorder, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That same voice, the same one from the phone call, now coming from an old tape recorder that hadn't been touched in years. I ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, trying to convince myself that none of it was real. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The calls didn't stop either. Every night, the same unknown number would flash on my phone, the same crackling voice whispering my name, calling me back to that house. Weeks passed, and I couldn't take it anymore. I had to sell the house, get rid of everything connected to it. But even after the house was sold, and I thought I was finally free, the calls kept coming. Now, they didn't just happen at night. They came at random times during the day, at work, while I was driving, even in the middle of conversations with friends. No matter how many times I changed my number or blocked the calls, they always found a way through. It's been 2 years since that night, and the calls still haunt me. I never went back to the basement, and I've stopped answering the phone altogether, but deep down, I know that no matter what I do, the voice will never leave me. It's waiting, always waiting, for the moment I finally answer again. I don't know what it wants from me, but whatever it is, I'm terrified of finding out.